Order, please. Daily routine, presenting and reading petitions. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to make an introduction, if I may do so.
Most certainly.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, I would like to draw your attention to the gallery, to our East Gallery. We have with us today some people from our province's highly dedicated and professional police officers. We have from the RCMP, Inspector Greg Bursey and Sergeant Joe Taplin. In attendance from the Halifax Regional Police, Superintendent Sean Alt and Constable Ali Nelson. I would ask that the police officers representing us here today to rise and receive the warm welcome of the House.
We welcome all our visitors to the gallery and hope that they enjoy this morning's proceedings. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Police Week takes place in various regions across Canada during the month of May to recognize police services and increase community awareness. And whereas the police services provided in Nova Scotia contribute to the public safety and security they provide to their communities. And whereas police encourage community involvement and initiatives of activities while providing a critical service to protect Nova Scotians. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House respect, appreciate, and recognize the work of the police services in Nova Scotia and support the proclamation of May 13th to 18th, 2012 as Police Week in Nova Scotia. And, Mr. Speaker, and I ask for waiver and notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. Notices of motion. The Honourable Member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day. I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Mr. Gary Linthorne and Mr. John Peters are well-known figures in the football community in Nova Scotia, and whereas Mr. Linthorne and Mr. Peters recently visited all schools in Lunenburg County to gauge interest in the formation of a new minor football league, which resulted in the successful formation of the Seahawks team. And whereas the Seahawks Adam Division will include grade 4 and 5 students, and the Pee Wee Division will include grade 6 and 7 students, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Mr. Linthorne and Mr. Peters for organizing this league, which will contribute to the health and personal development of many young people in Lunenburg County, and wish them success going forward. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Justice on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is once again that I have the privilege to acknowledge fine guests that are in the East Gallery here today. I'd like to first acknowledge one of our employees, Ross McLaren with Communications Nova Scotia, and his wife Louise, who are here with their daughter Maggie, and Maggie is here on learning about the government, and she's taking this up in school, and she wanted to bring along two special friends of hers, her cousins, Willem Van Wart, who's 8 years old, and Louis Van Wart, who is 6 years old, and both Willem and Louis's father is a member of our public prosecution services. And so I would ask them to stand and receive the warm welcome in this House, and what a privilege it is to have them here.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoy this morning's proceedings. I will now recognize the honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas after 3 years of NDP mismanagement through tax hikes, fee increases, and skyrocketing power rates, the economy of Nova Scotia has stalled at 0.3% GDP growth. Whereas this government keeps making decisions like hiking the HST, increasing user fees, allowing power rates to soar, refusing to take the tax off a tax on gasoline, adding a tax on every power bill in the province, and refusing to end bracket creep on income tax, all of which has made Nova Scotia a tougher place to do business and less affordable place to live. And whereas even as the NDP hike taxes and fees and allow higher and higher power rates, it's the same NDP government who has cut $65 million from education, ensuring that hundreds of classroom teachers, librarians, support staff positions will be and are currently being cut. Therefore, be resolved that members of this House remind members of the NDP that as this Premier and his NDP cabinet, through their endless tax hikes, fees and power rate hikes, as well as their cuts to education, who have made business less competitive and life less affordable in Nova Scotia. And Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for waiver.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? No. I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, whereas May 13th to 19th is Police Week in Canada and is dedicated to increasing community awareness and recognition of policing service in our communities. And whereas police officers are local heroes who risk their lives every day to keep their communities safe and protected. And whereas Nova Scotians and all Canadians owe a debt of gratitude to the police officers in their communities. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the legislature recognize this and salute the important work our brave police officers do in every community in Nova Scotia and thank them for making our province safer and more secure. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Tony White's success as a champion bowler has resulted in him having the highest average in the province at 128.76 in the 1989-90 season, and he anchored provincial championship teams in 1990-1992. And whereas Tony White won the World Candlepin Singles Championship in 1998, holds the highest average ever recorded at his home lanes, and is listed as one of the top bowlers in Nova Scotia for the past 20 years. And whereas on May 5th, 2012, Tony White was inducted into the Yarmouth Town and County Sports Heritage Association's Hall of Fame, therefore be it resolved that members of this House of Assembly congratulate Tony White on being inducted into the Yarmouth Town and County Sports Heritage Association's Hall of Fame and recognize him as a world-class championship bowler and thank him for his contributions to sports in Yarmouth. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Cape Breton Sports Hall of Fame recognizes the island's top athletes, teams, coaches, officials, and builders, and whereas Wilf Hook Edmund will be introduced into the Hall of Fame at the 2012 awards banquet as a member of the 1961 Caledonia Aces Maritime Senior Softball Champs. And whereas the 1961 Caledonia Aces were a legendary team built on speed, power, defense, hitting, and pitching, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Wilf Hook Edmund for receiving this honor and wish him and his teammates the very best in the future. And Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Richmond.
Speaker, be presenting this resolution on behalf of the member for Annapolis, the Leader of the Official Opposition. Whereas the University of King's College is known nationally and internationally for its interdisciplinary programs and the valuable contributions its alumni make to our province, country, and world. Whereas last evening, the University of King's College Alumni Association awarded the Honourable Russell McClellan the Judge J. Elliott Hudson Distinguished Alumnus Award for significant contributions to his profession and community. Whereas 22 years of dedicated public service to the people of Cape Breton and Nova Scotia, his distinguished legal career, and significant contributions to the international Taekwondo community make Russell most deserving of this distinguished award. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House of Assembly extend our congratulations to our former Premier, the Honourable Russell McClellan, and wish him many more years of continued contributions, success, and help. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 7 athletes between the ages of 10 and 16 of the Highland Wrestling Club, North of Smoky, competed at the Atlantic Canada Wrestling Championship in Newfoundland in March. And whereas encouragement and support from families, superior guidance from Coach Duncan McKinnon, and hard, long hours of cardio training by all determined team members paid off. And whereas the Highland Wrestling Club successfully brought home 6 gold medals and 1 bronze, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly applaud and congratulate Coach Duncan McKinnon, team wrestlers Cole Berry, Jesse Thornton, Cody McKinnon, Johnny Fraser, Russell McAvoy, Hilary Burton, and Charles Fraser, and wish them the best in all their future endeavours. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas power bills have risen 20% since the NDP government was elected in 2009, and whereas on May 8, 2012, Nova Scotia Power announced it will attempt to take more money out of the pockets of Nova Scotians with a proposed rate increase in 2013, 2014, and likely in 2015, and whereas an online petition has been started by outraged Nova Scotians, which calls upon the House of Assembly to use whatever power it may have to deny NSPI from seeking power rate increases in 2013, 2014, and 2015. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly support the online petition's intent and call upon the Premier and the NDP government to appear before the rate hearing to deny Nova Scotia Power's proposed rate increases over the next 3 years. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? No. I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the municipality of Victoria County celebrated its 39th annual Volunteer Recognition Night recently during Volunteer Week in Canada, and whereas Dana McNeil, nominated by the Nova Scotia Highland Village Society and recognized for her work at the Highland Village, was awarded a Municipality of Victoria County Youth Volunteer Award. And whereas Dana, who has assisted with many events such as Highland Village Day and Highland Village famous Codfish Supper, received the award for her dedication and contribution to her community, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly recognize Dana as a Youth Ambassador for Victoria County and congratulate and thank Dana for her contributions to her community. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas May 7th to the 13th is Naturopathic Medicine Week, and whereas naturopathic doctors are trained as primary care practitioners and can complement and enhance healthcare services provided by other healthcare professionals, whereas throughout this week, naturopathic doctors have and will travel the province speaking to Nova Scotians about natural medicine, health promotion, and disease prevention. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the legislature acknowledge May 7th to the 13th as Naturopathic Medicine Week and extend our appreciation to the Nova Scotia Association of Naturopathic Doctors for all of their contributions both this week and year-round in helping Nova Scotians learn more about health awareness and preventive medicine. Mr. Speaker, I ask for a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Halifax Regional Search and Rescue's Eco Endurance Challenge was held on May 5th to May 6th, 2012, and whereas the Eco Endurance Challenge fundraising event challenge your navigation abilities as well as your endurance in the backcountry, and whereas 196 participants took part in the Challenge 1 competition for emergency and search and rescue responders, therefore be resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate Yvonne Thibodeau, Jody Camo, and Johnny Thibodeau for finishing third in the competition with a score of 230 points, 5 controls, and wish them continued success in future competitions. Mr. Speaker, I would ask waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Father John McPherson was ordained on May 8th, 1992 at Queen of Heaven Chapel, CFB Greenwood by then Archbishop Austin Burke, and celebrated his first Mass on May 9th, 1992. And whereas Father John McPherson has been faithfully serving the parishioners of St. Ambrose Cathedral in Yarmouth for many years as parish priest and vicar. And whereas on May 8th, 2012, to celebrate the 20th anniversary of Father John McPherson's ordination to the priesthood, a special Mass was held at St. Ambrose Cathedral, followed by a filled-to-capacity reception where parishioners expressed their gratitude, appreciation, and deep affection for Father John. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate Father John McPherson on the 20th anniversary of his ordination to the priesthood and thank him for his unwavering devotion and service to the people of his parish. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas since October 2007, the Halifax West High School Rotary Interact Club has been sponsored by the Rotary Club of Halifax Northwest and has been encouraged and guided by a dedicated teacher, Nicole Simons-White. And whereas with the leadership of this year's president, Kevin Power, the club has been involved in a record number of activities from fundraising for the Out of the Cold shelter in Halifax and polio eradication in Africa and other causes to serving at this Sunday suppers at St. Andrew's Church. And whereas in recognition of his leadership qualities, international awareness and understanding, and the humanitarian service he has developed through involvement in the Interact Club, Kevin Power has been awarded a Rotary International Ambassadorial Scholarship to study in Hamburg, Germany this fall. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House congratulate Kevin Power, President of the Halifax West Interact Club, for the tremendous contributions he makes in his school and community and wish him success with his upcoming exchange to Germany. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Duke of Edinburgh Award encourages young people to become active and engaged citizens and challenges them to develop new skills and learn what it means to exemplify leadership. And whereas Richard Patrick, a resident of Clayton Park, has received a silver Duke of Edinburgh Award for, among other things, achieving the Conservatory Level 8 in piano, volunteering with seniors at his church, and tutoring students in English as a second language, French and math at Fountain Academy of the Sacred Heart, where he attends school. Whereas Richard chose a canoe and portage trip to Ketchimakujik National Park as his practice journey for the award, and later returned with 2 other silver candidates to lead a group of young people on a 3-day portaging, hiking, and canoeing excursion. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House congratulate Richard Patrick on receiving this prestigious award and wish him continued success as a leader in our community. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. I will now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader for Government Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we should now leave the chair and the House resolve itself in the whole House on bills.
Carried.
please. The Committee of the Whole House on Bill come to order. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, could you please call Bill 57, Crosby Memorial Trust Fund Act?
I call Bill number 57, the Crosby Memorial Trust Fund Act.
Madam Chair, Bill 57 comes back from the Committee on Private and Local Bills without any amendments.
Shall Clause 1 carry? Shall the remaining clauses carry? Shall the title carry? Shall the bill carry? Carried. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, could you please call Bill 83, an act to incorporate the Annapolis Valley Apple Blossom Festival?
I now call Bill number 83, an act to incorporate the Annapolis Valley Apple Blossom Festival.
Madam Chair, Bill number 83 comes back from the Committee on Private and Local Bills without any amendments.
Shall Clause 1 carry? Shall the remaining clauses carry? Shall the title carry? Shall the bill carry? Carried. Recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Could you please ask the committee to now rise and report progress?
Motion is carried. We'll now rise and report progress to the House. That's okay.
The chair of the committee reports.
The chair of the Committee of the Whole House on Supply reports
That the Committee of the Whole has met and considered the following bills, Bill number 57 and Bill number 83 without amendments, and that the chairman has been instructed to recommend that these bills to the favorable consideration of the House.
carried. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Good job. Mr. Speaker, with the indulgence of the House, I wonder if we could move Bills 57 and 83 for third reading today.
Agreed. All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Government House Leader.
If he wishes, he can. Mr. Speaker, please call private and local bills for third reading.
Private and local bills for third reading. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 57, the Crosby Memorial Trust Fund Act?
Bill number 57, the Crosby Memorial Trust Fund Act. The motion is for third reading of Bill number 57, the Crosby Memorial Trust Fund Act. All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. The motion is carried.
Bill number 57, an act to amend Chapter 17 of the Acts of 2003, the Crosby Memorial Trust Fund Act.
Order that the bill do pass. Order that the title be as read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 83, an act to incorporate the Annapolis Valley Apple Blossom Festival?
Bill number 83, an act to incorporate the Annapolis Valley Apple Blossom Festival. The question, all those in favor? The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Wow.
Come on, James.
Glad to have an opportunity to speak to the two sentences that are in this bill this morning, Mr. Speaker. You know, I think it's fine that the Honourable Member puts forward a bill to make a rather simple change, and we've seen that go through the House, and I mean, it's just a matter of adding to the number of bills over there. I think the session has been pretty limited on the value of what's been in the bills over there, actually, Mr. Speaker. But this particular bill, you know, the Apple Blossom Festival is quite an event, Mr. Speaker. It's been going on for nearly 80 years in the Valley, and it's been supported by, and I remember every one of them, my honourable colleague says, what a thing to say to a guy on a Friday. Mr. Speaker, I think what's most important here is that we take the time and we'll put these bills through that are, I don't want to call it meaningless. It does mean something to the organization there, that's for sure, and the Apple Blossom Festival. There's no question about that, but it's a very minute change that's obviously somebody has brought to the attention of the member perhaps, or it's just another reason to put a bill through. But Mr. Speaker, most importantly what I'm wondering is how much that member is standing up and talking to government and supporting that local organization by way of funding, because we know that the funding, Mr. Speaker, is probably not quite what it used to be. And this is a big event for the Valley. This is a huge economic driver for the Valley, Mr. Speaker. So I hear the Minister over there of Communities, Culture and Heritage. I hope he's 100% on board and that he's putting the appropriate investment into the Annapolis Valley. As we know, Mr. Speaker, what's important about that event and the money going into the Valley is the fact that the Valley's lost hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of jobs, Mr. Speaker. So every bit of help that we can get in there in supporting a great opportunity like this. It is one of the largest festivals, Mr. Speaker, in the Valley, and it should be supported, along with lots of other good festivals around the province. There's no question about that, Mr. Speaker. So I wanted to make the point that I hope that the member and the member for King South, I'm sure she also is doing her piece to support the Annapolis Valley Apple Blossom Festival and that organization, and I hope that both of them are taking advantage of the government's ear to acquire the appropriate funding that festival needs to operate as they have in past years and support that accordingly, Mr. Speaker. And you know, as I said, every bit of help that they can get as we move into what will soon be 80 years. It might even be, I think it's the 79th year this year perhaps, and I should know that because I've got an invitation sitting on my desk to the annual event, which is always a great time and well attended by folks throughout the Valley, certainly from around the province and from outside of this country. There have been maybe from Shelburne and down the South Shore in that area too. I know people come from all over, Mr. Speaker, to attend this great event. And with those few words, the last thing I would say to this is congratulate once again the great organizing committee that started already with the respective teas that go on and electing of princesses and so on and so forth. And with those few words, Mr. Speaker, I wish them the very best this season again for great weather and a great parade and lots of attendance, Mr. Speaker. So with that, I'll take my seat.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Pleased to rise in my place today and say a few words about the bill, but perhaps more importantly, the Apple Blossom Festival. And in fact, I was quite surprised when a member for Kings North brought the bill forward that it hadn't been incorporated actually over the years. So that's positive, and if it has some value, then that's fine. But I think the important point to make here today is that event tourism is so significant, and I'm not sure, you know, if the Department of Tourism, actually Economic and Rural Development and Tourism, but I'm not sure if tourism has really grasped how event tourism can be such a significant generator of income, not just for the local area, but for tourism. And you know, if we have a good weather day, you know, for the parade at the end of May, actually the first Saturday of June, we will no doubt. I guess maybe the parade is the 26th of May this year, and we'll probably have 100,000 people visit the valley. So the Apple Blossom Festival is one of the premier parades actually in the country, rating in the top 3. And so it's important that all Nova Scotians, if possible, come to the Annapolis Valley to celebrate the festival, celebrate really the apple industry. And it you know, it has its origins about 85 years ago, and it continues to grow. And another aspect of the Apple Blossom Festival now is an outstanding children's parade. So again, for families to come down and participate in the children's parade, make it a full day, or for many a full weekend, as we also attract visitors from across Canada and internationally. And there's always a wonderful event that's sponsored by AVR, and that is to bring a former Valley resident home. And I always watch with interest because over the years, a few actually former students came back to the Valley to join in the festival celebrations. So you know, it's an event that continues to appeal, and it requires the entire Valley really to put it off. And so hopefully once again the Valley community will come together and make this a very, very special celebration. And of course all eyes are on the fact as to whether or not the apple blossoms will be out in full measure on that particular weekend. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I take my place.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very happy to rise and just say a few words about the bill. And I must say I was a little disappointed to hear the member for Hants West minimize the importance of this bill. You know, sometimes, Mr. Speaker, very few words can matter a whole lot. And of course, the member for Kings West can probably be excused for not knowing that the Apple Blossom Festival, in fact, has been guided by an act of this legislature since 1935. And in fact, this small piece of business is an opportunity needed by the board of the Apple Blossom Festival to actually modernize their experience. The act, which was put in place in 1935, required changes to be made in this legislature, even to do things like updating bylaws. So this act actually gives the Apple Blossom Festival Board a group of volunteers who are dedicated to creating a very important social, cultural, and economic experience in the Annapolis Valley to do their work more efficiently and with less trouble. It also, these few words, Mr. Speaker, allow the Blossom Festival Board to handle their finances more efficiently. So in all of this, I think the few words are important. I do want to say, Mr. Speaker, that this activity in the Valley is an extremely important part of Nova Scotia's cultural experience. And you know, I think it's very interesting to think that in 1932, because in fact this event is 80 years old this year, when it was founded, this country and this province was in the midst of, at the beginning of the Great Depression. A group of innovative and hardworking people determined that maybe there were some ways to build something that could matter to the community, and that work blossomed in many ways. And for 80 years, it's been an important part of this province. It's where people spend either the last week of the last weekend of May or the first weekend of June. It does bring, in fact, tens of thousands of people to the Annapolis Valley. And I remember, just if I could, the Annapolis Valley is an extremely beautiful place, and I can remember last fall, actually, maybe a couple of months after the Apple Blossom Festival, meeting with an elderly man at a coffee shop in New Minas who was from Newfoundland, and he had a chance to have a little tour around the apple orchards of Kings County, and he was in a state of awe. He said in his 80-some years, he had never seen sights like he had seen that day. And I think the Apple Blossom Festival, Mr. Speaker, is one of the ways that we can bring attention to a productive, a fertile, a growing part of our province. And I'm very happy to have played a tiny part in that. And I would like to say in closing that I congratulate those members of the board of the Apple Blossom Festival for all of the work that they do, for their commitment to their community, for their commitment to extending a cultural institution in our province. And I will be happy to continue to support their work in every way that I can. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The question is for third reading of Bill number 83. Is the host ready for the question? All those in favor say aye. Those opposed say nay. Motion is carried.
Bill number 83, an act to amend Chapter 107 of the Acts of 1935, an act to incorporate the Annapolis Valley Apple Blossom Festival.
Order that the bill do pass. Order that the title be as read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. I will now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call public bills for third reading?
Public bills for third reading. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Could you please call Bill 17, the Financial Measures 2012 Act?
Bill number 17, the Financial Measures 2012 Act. The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that, and I'm pleased to get up today and speak to Bill 17, the Act respecting certain financial measures, which is also known as the Financial Measures Act. It's a companion piece, for those who are not aware, a companion piece that goes with the budget every year and includes the details of that often are required to changes in other acts in order to have the budget go forward. And this year we've commented on second reading about what an unusual FMA it is, because the majority of this bill this time relates to the formation of the pension corporation, and there's very little in the way of changes to tax regimes or anything that's current. There are only two provisions in it. One is the continuation of the path that was begun some years ago, I believe before the last election by the previous government, and that path was towards reducing small business tax, Mr. Speaker. That is in place, and that's a good thing, because it needs to be done, and it had already begun in the past. So we're holding the course on that, although other reductions were stopped. And it includes a promise, I think a cynical promise, an election platform promise, at least sometime ahead of an election. I don't believe it belongs in an FMA, and it's the promise to reverse the increase in HST, which the NDP government put in place in 2010. This FMA includes a promise to reverse the damage done by that earlier increase. As we know, we currently have the highest HST in the country, and that's a difficult thing for our province, and we've gone over that in the past. And Mr. Speaker, there's no question that along the HST promise, we had concerns. We feel it's something that the public do not believe, that making promises well in advance of the next mandate of the government is irresponsible. To suggest that you put it in there and that the fact that it is in legislation will make it stronger or make it more believable is just not true. What we've seen is previous legislation about balanced budgets, for example, very similar intent. The earlier government in the 2000s, I guess, the Conservative government brought in legislation that insisted that there would be balanced budgets every year. Well, as soon as that became financially difficult to do, the NDP just removed the legislation. At that time, we said, the Liberal Party said, don't remove it, put a 2-year extension on it, give yourself 2 years to recover from the bad economic circumstances, and then go back to the balanced budget legislation. But no, the NDP chose to just take that off the books, withdraw that, and it's gone. So the fact that you can do that so quickly and with a stroke of a pen eliminate what was intended to be sound, fiscal management, a good path for the province, just shows how much value there is in putting that in legislation. Now, the balanced budget legislation was at least current. It mattered year to year. This piece of legislation, this clause about the HST, is something that's being promised for the year 2014 and 15, after the next election will be called, beyond the 4-year mandate of this government. So even in the 5th year, in fact, since the election of this government. So, you know, cynical is the best word to define that. I think it's cynical on the part of the government, and I think the public looks at it with a cynical eye, because they've seen other promises broken, and I will go through a few of the others. But, Mr. Speaker, in referring to today's legislation, there have been a couple of amendments that had been proposed along the route to get us to 3rd reading. And as we know, and any members of the public that are watching today, 3rd reading is the final step towards enacting this piece of legislation. Provided it gets a majority of votes, of course, in the House on 3rd reading. After 2nd reading, the bill went to law amendments, and there were several, I thought, very good improvements suggested for this bill at law amendments. And the one in particular I'd like to speak to is around the comprehensive tax review. The Liberal Party put in an amendment asking that as part of the Financial Measures Act, we include a provision to do a comprehensive tax review. And we included all of the pieces of that review. And that would be an examination of our taxes in comparison to other jurisdictions, to see where we sit in relation to other provinces, which ones are we too high in, where could we adjust, and we also wanted to see an economic analysis of which taxes have the best impact in Nova Scotia if you lower them, if you adjust them. Where can you get the best bang for your buck, if you like, how we could tweak with certain ones that would make more impact on the formation of new businesses, on the encouraging people to hire more employees. As people may know, we get our largest share of taxes for the province from personal income tax. So if we can encourage employers to expand their workforce, hire one more person for small business or set up a new business, we're creating a lot more wealth for our province. But to do that, we need to create a competitive tax regime. And there has been no examination of the sort that we were proposing in the amendment at law amendments to have a comprehensive tax review done. And the government refused that. The government members of the committee said that it was in fact an exercise they conducted on an annual basis with the budget, but that is not done in the public eye. That information is not available, and I don't believe it's as extensive as we are talking about in a comprehensive tax review. It's nothing more really than I think a cursory look at the taxes, and much of it is just steady as she goes. There's been no major attempt to look at where we get the best impact of changing our taxes, of encouraging people who come back to Nova Scotia, putting a little bit more money back in the pockets of Nova Scotians that they in turn will spend in businesses here in our province. That's the way we want to create more stimulus and more economic activity. But as I said, out of hand, that was rejected at the Law Amendments Committee, and the government members voted against that amendment. So that was one thing that we think is certainly wrong with the FMA right now. And even more importantly, Mr. Speaker, in the path of this bill towards this 3rd reading today, we had yesterday at the Committee of the Whole another opportunity to introduce amendments. And the leader of the Liberal Party introduced a very substantial amendment to this bill. And it would have made a huge difference to our confidence in whether or not the government really themselves believe that they would lower the HST or in this future date of 2014. Do they believe it? You know, and without even really taking time to caucus it or to take any time at all, the government rejected our amendment. And I'd like to include the amendment just so that you know what I'm talking about today, Mr. Speaker. The amendment said that where the Minister of Finance fails to take such steps as are necessary under the Comprehensive Integrated Tax Coordination Agreement between the Government of Canada and the Government of Nova Scotia to reduce the rate of the provincial component of taxes payable under Part 9 of the excise tax from 10% to 9% on or before July 1st, 2014, the Premier shall forthwith provide advice to the Lieutenant Governor that the House of Assembly be dissolved and a general election be held. And Mr. Speaker, I know that members of the House understand what that means, but what it means to all others who might be reading this in the future or watching on television today, it means that if the government was truly committed to lowering the tax by 1 percentage point in 2014, they would pass this because if this were in place in the legislation, their failure to lower the HST would trigger an election. That's what it means, that they are really believing it so soundly that they would put that in as part of the legislation, and we would go to the polls if they failed in that promise to Nova Scotians. And we believe that if you're that strongly, you're going to campaign on it, you're going to speak about it in advance, you're going to try and I have to be careful which words I choose, Mr. Speaker, but basically encourage the public to believe something that is well off in the future and is I say, an empty promise, then put some teeth into it and say that you believe it so strongly. You know, there's an attitude here that you expect Nova Scotians to trust government. And I think that adding this amendment would have strengthened that tremendously. And we were prepared to look at that. We thought that's the way to go. If you believe it and put this into the legislation, that would have meaning. Without it, we believe it's meaningless, and we believe that it is cynical on the part of government to try and play with the hopes and aspirations of Nova Scotians, quite honestly, because they would like to see some tax relief. So the government is playing on those hopes, making really a very empty promise to Nova Scotians. And as I said, that amendment, when it was read here yesterday, was voted on. There was a recorded vote. Definitely all members of the government voted against the amendment, which meant they would not stand behind that. They would not commit themselves to go back to the polls and give the public a second chance to vote again should they fail to hold to their promise. Imagine, Mr. Speaker, if we could go back to the polls today with all the promises that have been broken in the first few years of this NDP government. Look how many have been turned. I mean, why are the public... Why are they cynical? They're cynical because the last election, the Premier of this province, who was then the leader of the NDP, sat in a leaders' debate and promised that he would not raise taxes, looked at the cameras, spoke to Nova Scotians, promised that there would be no new taxes and a balanced budget. Well, we've seen some of the largest deficits in ever, really, in the last couple of years. We've seen this year, the government loves to say, that they're doing well in terms of coming in under budget. And since this is a budget-related bill, I certainly think it's worth reminding the government that if you overestimate your expenses, you're going to come in a better position. If you underestimate your revenues and then they come in stronger, lo and behold, you're going to have a bigger spread between what you estimated and what you achieved. But let's remember, it's still a deficit, over $200 million in deficit this year alone. And that is a big hole to dig out of, no question about that. But the biggest point is that the promise was made, and the leader of the Liberal Party in that very same debate where the three leaders squared off, our leader was the only leader that told the truth and said, I cannot promise what I'm going to do about taxes and HST and balancing the budget, because we have to get in there and look at it. There'd been no opportunity to see how bad the situation really was. And I think that was the honest and really the best position you could take, was to say that we can't promise. Obviously, we're going to try and do our best to manage the resources and not raise taxes and come in on a balanced budget. That's what the leader of the Liberal Party said. And contrast that with the cavalier attitude of the Premier, who said, no, I'm going to do balanced budgets, I'm going to keep all the emergency rooms open, I'm going to do everything you want, everything that polling said. How did they do? Well, I've got a list of things to see how they did, and they have not done well. Let's start with the balanced budget. Balanced budget is no, it didn't happen.
They didn't balance the budget?
Increased taxes. 1,400 increased user fees off the bat last year. Every single user fee went up. Yep. Mr. Speaker, no new taxes. And in 2010, with just a year in office, the increase in the HST was brought down 2 percentage points that hurt everybody, every consumer, and particularly low-income consumers, because there's some products they have to buy, there is HST on it, and they don't have a lot of disposable income. So, that's, again, it's a question of integrity, Mr. Speaker. It's a question of whether you believe what you say before you go into an election. And I'm just sticking it so far to those provincial ones. There was a promise of no program cuts. There were all the platitudes about how important education is. And at the end of the day, this year in this budget again, we see another huge cut to education. We're talking about $65 million in total the last 2 years. Pulled right out of the education budget. And we know that the boards and others have cut to the bone to manage with this. Those cuts are now, and even last year, felt in the classroom. We're losing all kinds of specialists and support to teachers. We're seeing fewer teachers replaced. It's hurting every single school board, and we've seen the stats come down. The government, in fact, Mr. Speaker, wants us to leave here soon so that they don't have to keep talking about the cuts to education. HRSB came down with their cuts yesterday or the day before, and wouldn't the government have loved it if we could have gotten out of here before we heard that over 150 teachers are gone from HRSB next year? And that's going to continue. We know that every single board is hit. And honestly, Mr. Speaker, I know the members on the other side of the House are just wishing they could go home to their ridings and not hear any more about it. That's what they're telling me. They want to go and hunker down at home. But there are things that the government has to take responsibility for. The government would not adopt. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are a list of broken promises. I've talked about the no tax increases, which brought in the HST, the balanced budget legislation, which was removed, program cuts. I haven't, on the program cuts.
How did they do?
Mr. Speaker, I haven't even begun to talk about the program cuts. Education is one department that's felt it very strongly. Health cuts as well, with the passing on of large increases in wage settlements that are with no money following to help the DHAs. We know there's going to be more cuts that patients will feel. I love the promise to keep ERs open 24/7. And we knew that ERs in small communities were stressed because of the lack of staffing, the difficulty in finding doctors and nurses to staff 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And again, it bears repeating that the leader of the Liberal Party didn't make those kind of easy promises, and exactly. The leader of the Liberal Party stood up and said, we'll have to look at it. Even in a small community that he represents, he knew that it was something that needed to be studied. But what a simple promise to offer to Nova Scotians, to say all ERs open 24/7. That's what people expected. They expected the status quo because the government said they were going to get those closures. They were going to stop the intermittent and unscheduled closures of ERs. They were going to provide stability, and that if I lived in a small community, I would be able to trust that my ER was open. That's what they thought. There were a few ridings that did question that. You're right. Digby County was questioning whether that would really happen. We have a few good members on the Liberal bench here as a result of that. But those promises were music to the ears. Mr. Speaker, they were music to the ears of people who felt the insecurity around their health care, who were worried about the access to emergency care in their communities. And they weren't told, we're going to engage on a long round of consultation and come up with a new and better model for you. They were told, ERs open 24/7. Simple soundbite. And this government's great with little sound bites. But that isn't what the government's delivering right now. And that's not to say that these care models are not going to work or aren't good. The fact of the matter is it was a promise that was reneged upon. That has been twisted and changed, and the government may try to pretend that they're meeting their obligation, but it's a break from that soundbite and that promise that was written in publications, in campaign literature that went around the province. And it was speaking to some of the concerns that Nova Scotians had. Like, will there be an emergency room if my family are sick in my community? Will I get that help? That's right. So there's another promise. What about the promise to get rid of the immoral tax on tax? And I use the word immoral because the Minister of Finance called it immoral. He said it's just like the government digging in your pocket and taking out more money, taking out double tax when you buy gasoline in this province, because we put the HST, which is now 2% higher, and we put it on top of a fuel tax already. So that is something that the NDP had spoken against and been loudly opposed to, and in government has allowed to perpetuate. Another broken promise. People had expectations. The record of what the government had spoken about for years were expected to be continued. And I think it's, you know, it really is a travesty that so many of these items have been, you know, ignored. And I say items, promises. So many of these promises have been totally ignored. And anybody over there should really be worried to go out to the polls again in a year's time or less and try and defend a record of broken promises. You know, I think it really is shameful. Another one is the IES slush fund. The IEF, which is the Industrial Expansion Fund, is larger now than it has ever been. And changing the name of it to some new name is not going to change the fact that it is a slush fund at the discretion of the cabinet to invest in big businesses all over. You know, and believe me, that money isn't going to the little businesses. We often hear from small businesses who say there are no special funds for us to access, no way for us to get over a difficult period of time. But there's millions of dollars, absolutely millions of dollars going to. Let me just see. Millions of dollars going to companies like the Irving contract, a very profitable company who just won a $25 billion contract. We're delighted that they have that contract, but do they need, you know, the question Nova Scotians are asking is, do they need $300 million in public money? Is that necessary? I don't care how many years they spread it over, it still comes to $300 million, and I love the misnomer of a forgivable loan. A forgivable loan going to the biggest company in Atlantic Canada. You know, that's, you know, you'd love to, you know, the government would love to say it's black and white. We don't want shipbuilding, you know, because we're questioning a huge investment of public money in a profitable company. You know, you have to put two and two together. It's tax money.
How much did they
Order. Order. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Madam Speaker, it's a pleasure for me to continue to talk about the Financial Measures Act, and there are so many other points in it in this act as well that I want to go on about. But you know, honestly, the Nova Scotian public are asking where their taxes are going, and they're happy to pay for education. They believe in education. They know that's the key to our future. They question large amounts of money going to companies like the Resolute company in Queens County, which has, you know, Bow-Waters, that's right, better known as Bow-Water, which is the long-time name. Money that then left our province and went to support other pulp mills in Quebec, I believe, was where it went, 25 million of that. You know, they question when we're putting in large amounts of money whether the benefit is there. And when we talk about, well, it's $300 million to Irving, they question whether or not that was necessary to win the contract. Did we have to go in for so much money? And what's the benefit to Nova Scotia? That case needs to be made. And we have other investments. We have the Daewoo plant in New Glasgow that took over one of the Trenton works, I think it was. And that's about $60 million investment there. I don't know whether we're getting any production off that plant yet. It was supposed to be creating wind turbines. And we have a big investment now as a provincial government in that. We don't know how it's going, and there's no feedback, but $60 million. When you start to add this up, you're getting, you know, well over $500 million and higher. You know, as I say, there's many other examples of this that have been going on. But I started by saying we have an IEF fund, which has grown to be larger than it ever was under the previous government or under the earlier Liberal governments. It has been pumped up to a huge amount, and it's at the discretion of the cabinet, which really means it's a slush fund for political purposes. And that was a fund that previous members that are sitting there today, the finance minister who used to be the finance critic, the premier who used to be a critic as well of economic and other issues, all of them spoke against the IEF. They were outraged at the kind of spending that went through without legislative approval, without departments having a say, without proper business cases. They were outraged. But today it's okay because we've renamed the fund something new. It was the Industrial Expansion Fund. I think it's a jobs fund now. Must be a jobs fund because jobs now, jobs here, jobs there. You know, but that, again, there's an awful lot of sound bites and slogans that come out of this government. One area we know the government's increased spending in is communications, because they have communications officers traveling with all the ministers, taking pictures every day all over the place. In fact, in critical announcements, they won't make the announcement till all the people have arrived to take the pictures and make sure it's properly recorded for posterity in the next election. But in the next election, Madam Speaker, what's going to be remembered are moves that were promises broken at every turn. And Madam Speaker, I want to go back to this promise that's now enshrined in the FMA, the idea that in 2014 a cent will be taken off of the HST, and again in 2015 a second percentage point off that HST. And you know, the fact of the matter is, if the government truly believed it was doable, there was no impediments, they were going to do it, they put it in legislation, then why not accept the amendment from the Liberal Party that said, if you don't do it, you trigger an election? I mean, what could be more certain that you really believe what you're saying? And it wouldn't be the first time that in a democracy there's been an election as a result of changes in circumstances. That's not unprecedented. It's happened before. As I say, Madam Speaker, it was an opportunity for the government to stand up and show that they still have some idealism. Some of the idealism that got them elected last time, some of the idealism that people were looking for, some of the change that people expected in the way you do business in government. But none of that has materialized under the NDP. None of it. Not true. Madam Speaker, we see a government that's more conservative than the Conservatives were in most respects, and frightened to take changes, cautious beyond belief about changes, even after years of speaking out, being so knowledgeable, in fact, being a bunch of know-it-alls, really. In opposition, knew everything, had the answers to everything. And, you know, I mean, I listened and I often admired some of the things said in opposition, but I don't see the changes happening now. And that is really what we're looking for, is where's the, you know, the sense of mission that once was there? I think it's gone. I really do. And again, why not say we're different, and we will put in this legislation that if we don't keep this promise, we'll trigger an election. We're ready to go that far. Why not? There was no discussion. There wasn't a break to ring the bells to go and caucus this. It was a pretty quick decision to turn down that amendment. And, you know, I understand there's politics at play on every part in the government when we sit here and we're in the legislature, but it was an opportunity to show that the government is serious about what they're saying. Madam Speaker, yesterday I mentioned in question period a number of points that are question marks around the future financial capacity of our government here in Nova Scotia. One of them is that the shipyard had announced that they won't be beginning the actual cutting of steel till 2015. That is a delay. They've pushed out the start of this project a little bit further than was expected. So 2015 is when they start to cut the steel for the ships. And we know there's so many other components to the shipbuilding. I understand the technology and everything else. But the fact is that should change our financial projections on when the benefit from the shipbuilding contract starts to be seen in employment and in business activity. And that was one uncertainty that we know has sort of come into the picture. Another one is the Donkin mine, which has had some discussion around the mine opening in Cape Breton. I believe they're looking for another buyer now to run that mine. There's been some dispute around how the coal will be moved when they begin to mine it. So we have two things. And that is important, Madam Speaker, because RBC, the Royal Bank, in their projections for Nova Scotia's future income, to say where we would be in terms of economic growth, said there were 4 important projects that were going to increase our growth. One was the Donkin mine, one was the shipyard project, the second 2 are Deep Panook, and the last one is the Shell offshore again. So 2 in the petroleum sector, the shipyard and the Donkin mine. And with 2 of them either delayed or under maybe a little cloud of whether or not they're going forward, I think that we have a real concern that the government's estimates on revenue are going to be off, that then they're not going to have that money just from our local economy growth. Now, there's also issues around the federal growth as well, and that comes from a change that the federal government wants to make to health funding, and we are going to be the losers in that. Population is going to be used as a measure, almost a sole measure to hand out the federal dollars for health care, and we are going to lose as a population that has a pretty flat population and an aging population, which are much more expensive when it comes to healthcare costs. So the government, I'm sure, has begun to make some estimates on how that's going to hit us financially, but we have to look at that. And we have to consider whether or not those costs are going to, those decreases in transfer payments from the federal government are going to impact our financial capacity to go forward with an HST cut in 2014. So, and there are a couple of other things going on as well. I'm going to just look. We have the health transfers. Oh, we have another federal government initiative, and that is that they want to lock up a lot more criminals, people who break the law, wrongdoers. They have the federal government has a strong attitude towards that. They're not much for restorative justice. They're not much in favor of helping people to overcome difficulties. They're much more in favor of locking people up. And that cost is going to come back here to our province. And I'm not saying that the provincial government that we have today endorses that. I'm not saying that's the philosophy of our government, but we're going to end up with the cost of those jails. We don't have enough jails right now. In fact, right now, a big problem we have at Burnside and other jails is that they're overcrowded. We have too many people in small spaces, and there are a lot of problems that come with that. I understand even on the weekends, people coming in on the weekends to Burnside are put on cots in some of the open public areas. They don't have room, you know, in the common areas, I should say. None of the areas at Burnside are public, but the common areas like the cafeteria and so on, they'll set up cots because they don't have room there to keep the people who are in serving sentences on the weekend. So what are we going to do when those costs come back to roost here in Nova Scotia? And we won't be talking about one 50-person or roughly that size jail for the New Glasgow area. We'll be talking about the need to build a lot of new jails. And who's going to pay for it? The people of Nova Scotia, I guess, will have to, unless we can fight this. Again, these are costs that are going to have to be figured in the future that I'm sure will impact the capacity of our province to lower taxes. So what we were asking for in the FMA was some assurance, some further proof that the NDP are serious about that decision, that they have made this promise and put it in a piece of legislation in the hopes that Nova Scotians will believe it, and we're saying we don't believe it. And the refusal of the NDP to, Madam Speaker? Okay, we'll have a little break for an introduction. Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Antigonish on an introduction.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to indicate that in the East Gallery this morning we have two guests, Mary Chisholm from Antigonish, and with her is Amelia Del Marchio. Amelia is a senior policy analyst with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business for Nova Scotia, and Mary is a student with her taking a Master's Public Administration at Dalhousie currently, and she's her credits are she's an accomplished bagpiper, I understand. She placed third in the World Pipe Band Championships in Glasgow, Scotland last summer. And she's an intern now with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business here in Nova Scotia. So I would ask the host to give these two their usual warm welcome.
We welcome you to the gallery today and hope you enjoyed today's proceedings. I recognize the honourable member for Halifax, Clayton Park.
Thank you very much again, Madam Speaker, and it's a pleasure to make time for introductions when people come to the House. We're pleased about that. Madam Speaker, I was talking about the budget, the Financial Measures Act as well, and the impact that this budget's going to have on Nova Scotians, particularly in sectors like education and health. And education, I think, is the key one that Nova Scotians are worried about for the future. We expect and we need health care every day, and we worry about our family, but we know that the future of our province and the development of our province is going to hinge on having well-educated young people and opportunities for higher education, support in the classroom that's going to allow people to overcome any difficulties they may have, particularly things like reading difficulties, learning disabilities. To have the support there early on is going to mean that these young people will succeed, and we know that. There's all kinds of evidence, ample evidence, that investing in schooling, and particularly in special supports at an early age, are going to help young people succeed. And what we have here is a budget that's going to cut again over $30 million out of the education system. And Madam Speaker, today's paper here that's in front of me, I guess it's the Metro I have in front of me, has a large article where the Minister of Education actually says that these cuts are fine because they're restoring balance. Restoring balance by cutting teachers, 150 teachers out of our school system just here in HRM alone, not counting all the other boards that have had to make significant cuts. And today in the paper there is an educator that has been interviewed who said that the fewer teachers, which is the definite result in the HRSB budget, 150 teaching jobs, they said they will be cutting for next year, leaving many local educators worried. It says fewer teachers will result in lower quality education, and that comes from the head of the English department at Prince Andrew High School. No question about it. Yes, I think we'll just we'll take this page out, and you can have that. I think it should be in the record of the province of Nova Scotia that teachers themselves, this is not a union representative or somebody, a researcher at the teachers union. This is a teacher on the job at Prince Andrew High School and saying this is going to hurt and we're going to have trouble. We're going to have a lower literacy rate than we currently do. We're going to have higher dropout rates than we currently do. We're going to lose young people that need that extra support, that might need some one-on-one help along the way. And we can't do that if we don't have the teacher assistants, if we don't have the resource teachers, if we don't have guidance teachers, if we're not there to help young people when they have issues and problems and needs. And you can't go and slash the education budget and still expect an outcome that's going to be good. You just can't. Yeah. And I think we have tabled that now. Yes, I would hope that all members on the other side of the House, government members, will have a look at that article, because, you know, a number of the members on the other side are teachers themselves. You know, surely their own professional knowledge would tell them this is the wrong way to go. Again, if they'd gone for the day in a school, the MLA's invitation to go to a local school and spend a day with teachers and the principals, they would again have seen what kind of stresses there are in school. It's not the same as just going to a presentation or an assembly. It's going in. Maybe a few people maybe did go, I'm not sure. But I do know that a majority in the NDP caucus did not go to the day in the schools. And so, you know, I can't tell who did or who didn't. There's a few nodding heads. But I know that there were many. The teachers union kept a record, so we can, you know, the public can go online and see who went and who didn't. Who signed the petition for kids not cuts? Who said that? Kids not cuts. That's the NSTU petition that's online and handwritten as well for people who signed it. They got thousands of signatures going to malls, bowling alleys, schools, churches, everywhere they could find people gathered. They collected thousands of signatures and even more online to say we need to put our emphasis on the kids, and we can't be just cutting indiscriminately to do that. But the members of the government did not sign that. Yeah. Every member of the Liberal caucus signed that petition because we believe that they are there for the children, that the teachers in this province do care about education and the benefits that it brings to young people. And so that's very important, Madam Speaker, and we know that the FMA and the budget that it supports has cut teachers, has cut education, has hurt all of the supports that we need to have in place for the most vulnerable of our young people. You know, there's always going to be kids that'll do well, and there's going to be children that are going to private schools because their parents have the money, but we need to make sure we have the quality education that will keep everybody in our public schools, and we'll do things like have the IB program in more schools so that kids can have the enrichment they need. We need to extend those programs, and we need to have a support for public education, and that's not what I see at all in the last 3 years of the NDP government, and it is perpetuated in this budget, and it's perpetuated through the FMA as well. So, you know, that is a major concern to us, and I think should be to all Nova Scotians who care about our future, because we're going to be a backwater without it. Madam Speaker, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Pension Act that's included in this, in fact, makes up the lion's share of the pages in this act. It's a long act, and most of it deals with in fact, other than one page, it all deals with the formation of a pension corporation and really hiving off that function to an arm's-length corporation, taking it out of the control of government, setting up a governance board which would manage it. And what we're told is it means that in the future, the government will no longer be, I guess the right term would be bailing out the pension fund. There'll be a move towards joint administration so that employees and the government will both take equal responsibility. Even though it's going to be hived off and be a corporation, we have to remember half of the contributions in those funds come from taxpayers because they are the employer's share of all of the pension plans that all of our employees are receiving. So the employee makes a contribution and it's matched by the employer, and if the employer is the government of Nova Scotia, that's taxpayers' money. Now, Madam Speaker, that's going to be created as a separate entity. And you know, I think that it seemed like a lot of care has gone into the board and the requirements for funding and what will happen if a number of different scenarios occur. One thing I liked in the legislation is that in future they will not be giving pension holidays, which happened sometime in the past by law, that if a fund was a certain amount overfunded, that the employees no longer contributed. And that's led to a kind of disastrous situation because in those good years with high interest payments and high returns on investments, our employees stopped paying in because the plan was so well funded. And now we've gone through a period of very slow growth and low equity increases, and those funds are now underfunded, and it's created a real problem. So that won't happen again in future given the new governance rules that are here and put in place. But I have two problems that I'd like to just raise today, and maybe the Minister of Finance might be able to provide an answer today, I'm not sure, but one would be whether or not the new pension corporation would be captured under our FOIPOP legislation. In other words, could there be any freedom of information requests made of that pension corporation, and could our freedom of information officer or you know, the director have the authority to look at that pension corporation at all in the future? And the second one is, would it be an entity that could be audited by the Auditor General? Would there be that level of scrutiny for the pension corporation in the future? And I had the opportunity to call the Auditor General's office, but that was only this morning when this question had come up. And the actual Auditor General, Jacques Lapointe, wasn't available this morning, so I wasn't able to talk to him. So I did speak to another auditor who couldn't answer the question because it wasn't something they discussed. But I would like to ask the question about just, has the government considered that, and whether they can answer today whether or not the new entity would be subject to FOIPOP legislation and subject to our Auditor General's Act. So I think those are important, again, from a scrutiny and governance point of view, and I don't know if the answer would be available or not, but I would like to ask the question today about whether or not that has been looked at. And my second concern around the creation of the pension corporation is that a number of employees, quite a number of employees, will be changing from civil service benefits and being part of the civil service to being employees of this corporation. And that has happened in the past, Madam Speaker. It happened when we created the property assessment group. I don't know if that's called a corporation, but we hived off all of the assessors and the responsibility for assessing properties into a separate entity. Was it corporation? And anyway, the property valuation group, anyway, they're separate, and my understanding was when we hived off all those employees that had previously been in Service Nova Scotia, that they were given guarantees and provisions that enshrined all the benefits they had as civil servants, so that they could go forward with the same employment benefits and the same employment contracts. And that was a guarantee that they were given. I'm not sure that same provision is provided in the current Act, and we heard yesterday a little bit about this around the Nova Scotia Agriculture College, which is also being hived off by being given to Dalhousie University. Dalhousie will now have control, and in the past, all the employees of the Agriculture College were civil servants. They were paid through the budget of the Department of Agriculture. So as they've moved off, there's some concern as well about whether we provided provisions that will protect them. And in fact, Madam Speaker, today, at law amendments, we actually have, I believe, the NSGEU, the employee, Nova Scotia Government Employees Union, has representation at law amendments this morning to speak to the concerns of employees around the Agricultural College and the treatment of their employees as they move towards being employed by Dalhousie University. So we want to know, at the same token, what happens to the pension employees as they move into this pension corporation. Are there questions around whether or not their benefits will be protected? And I think that those are very legitimate questions to ask today as we look at the Financial Measures Act. And I'm sure that's what the government would like us to talk about, some of those details rather than broken promises. But I'm sorry, you can't escape the fact that broken promises come up the minute a document like the Financial Measures Act begins to make new promises that are unnecessary at this point in time because they don't relate to this year's budget. They don't relate to next year's budget. They relate to 2014. And we know that there'll be an election between now and 2014 because that will be 5 years into the mandate of the NDP government. So this is a future promise far off in the future that's going to be impacted by things like our necessity to build new jails or fund things that are being passed down from the federal government. It'll be impacted by shortages in payments that we may get. I say shortages, decreases from federal government transfers around health and social transfers. We know we have a federal government that has very little heart when it comes to supporting provinces and supporting the equity of services across this province. The Harper government in Ottawa have shown their disdain for that. They are not happy to put more money into provinces that need help, like Nova Scotia. And we need to be able to fight them, and we need to be able to speak up and make the case that we have an older population, a more static population. It's not growing, and we need help on the health care. But given that it's not going to be there and it's going to decrease, we need to plan for that. And again, the Liberal government, or Liberal Party, the Liberal caucus, has not agreed that you can make this kind of blanket promise now and expect Nova Scotians to believe it. In the Financial Measures Act, it does not hold water. The government has repealed legislation in the past that they didn't want to follow through on. If, in fact, there are financial difficulties and we're not able to meet our economic growth targets, which RBC had said hinge on Deep Panook, Shell, the shipyard, and Donkin Mine, if we can't meet those financial obligations because our economy doesn't grow as expected, then there's going to be repercussions. And the first repercussion will be the government will say, well, we can't afford the HST reversal. Remember, the HST went up because the government chose that tax to increase. And now what they're trying to do is reverse it, make a promise to reverse it in advance of an election so that they won't have to really bear responsibility for having increased it in the first place. So now there's this attempt to reverse it. It makes it sound like you're giving people a break when in fact the government did the exact opposite. They put an extra tax on every Nova Scotian, on every item we buy, on gasoline, which is receiving a tax on top of a tax, and so on. So, Madam Speaker, we don't believe that's going to be the case. We put in an opportunity to introduce an amendment yesterday that would have said if the government doesn't achieve their goal of reducing the HST, it will be so serious that it will trigger an election. That if by July 1st, 2014, we haven't decreased by 1 cent the HST, that the Premier would go to the Lieutenant Governor and say, we couldn't do it, we're going back to the polls, we're going to explain ourselves to Nova Scotians and go for another run at the polls. Then Nova Scotians would know they had a chance to speak out again, that if the government did not do as it promised, if they put their trust in the NDP government again and gave their vote to the NDP members in their riding, that should they be misled there would trigger an election, they'd have a chance to go back to the polls. That's all we asked. And that has not been accepted. We think that it would have strengthened people's belief in what was presented in the Financial Measures Act. Right now, it's just a cynical move to add that in today for a budget year that's 2, 3, and 3 years away and more, and that we know there are endless possibilities of economic stress and unknowns that the government has not factored in making that promise. And it's really interesting that 2 weeks before the Premier promised this HST cut, the Finance Minister had said in another interview that he was not in a position to make cuts, that we're not there yet. It's not time. That was quoted in the Herald. The articles in the Chronicle Herald, it was about 2 weeks in advance, and it included the quote, I don't have it before me now, Madam Speaker, but the quote that said, if I ask the people of Nova Scotia which tax they'd like to have cut, of course they're going to say the sales tax. Economists might disagree, but who am I to tell them that? And I don't know, I mean, we have to be careful, I guess, how the media report things, because as a member of the opposition, I wasn't at that scrum and I wasn't in that interview, so I can only report what I saw in the paper, and that's what Nova Scotians see as well. So the minister, seems to disagree, but I said we have seen that and we've read it, and I do believe it. I do believe that we need to look at which taxes are the best taxes to raise or lower. We've suggested a comprehensive tax review that would be thorough, that would be complete, that would be public, that would be made public and be easy for people to understand. If we had that kind of a tax review, it would make the consultation piece that the Finance Minister did this year a lot more meaningful, because Nova Scotians would have access to that kind of information before they go online and choose and play around with the different choices that they could make about which taxes they want up or down or which programs they want funded. I can tell you, Madam Speaker, people want education funded. They believe that we have to build a province that is committed to education, and we know that the future is going to be bleak without a good education system. Madam Speaker, I don't think it comes as any surprise to say that the Liberal caucus will not be supporting this bill as it comes through for third reading, and we come to a vote on this. I want to make that clear. We object strongly to the $65 million in cuts that have come through to 30, did I say that right? $65 million over 2 years to education, cut out of the schooling of, and that's primary to grade 12, right out of the budget of education. We feel that's a travesty. We will not support that. We don't believe this piece of legislation that promises 2 years out to do something that the government would not say that they felt so strongly about that they would trigger an election if they don't do it. We thought that would be a real proof, a test to see whether they believed it. And in fact, we don't see that level of commitment from the NDP government. So I think that's another reason to say that this is inadequate. And again, Madam Speaker, I think I've been pretty clear on the broken promises that we've seen and why Nova Scotians deserve to feel cynical about the moves that are in this budget, and cynical about promises that are made by this government. And with that, Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to take my seat.
Thank you. I now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and let me just begin by saying that I appreciate the remarks of the member who spoke just a moment ago, who has done a very good and thorough job of reviewing the provisions of the bill that is before us. She shows a lot of class and a lot of wisdom. And in light of that, Madam Speaker, I just want to add a few remarks of my own as both the leader and the finance critic for the Progressive Conservative Party, starting with some of the less contentious provisions of the bill, such as those around the reform to pension governance in our province, which we largely support, because anything that strengthens pension governance, that sets our pension plans, the government and the teachers' pension plan, on a better path forward is obviously a measure that is worthy of support. Nova Scotians know that we have a heavy debt in this province. They know that we have a $13 billion net direct debt that they are each responsible for in their own way through their government. But they also know that we have other liabilities that are pension liabilities, like the one in the public service plan, like the one in the teachers plan, that are also there to be measured And so a step in improving the way those decisions are made around the ongoing health of those plans are good steps, and I just want to recognize that. We did have some concerns, ways that the governance of those plans could even be improved. Madam Speaker, I note that the pension agency will now have a governance committee which includes representatives of the employer, the province of Nova Scotia, representatives of the employees from the various government unions and so on, and one representative of current retirees. That is a step forward in governance, Madam Speaker, but I do want to note that all of those members, all 12, are in fact members of the pension plan that they are in charge of governing now. They're all beneficiaries under the pension plan, whether they are retired or whether they currently pay into the plan and accrue benefits under the plan. And an improvement over what the government has proposed would be to ensure that there is also some independent representation on the pension governance committee, like representation of the taxpayers of the province who are not themselves members of the government pension plan, so that we have a full view of all of those that contribute to that pension plan one way or another. After all, Madam Speaker, 60% of Nova Scotians do not have a pension plan of their own. In the private sector, that number rises above 80%. They are all taxpayers. They're all contributors by their taxes to the government and teachers' pension plan, and yet they are not represented on the governance committee. The other thing we know, Madam Speaker, is that only 1 in 4 Nova Scotians who are not in a pension plan can afford to make a contribution to their own RRSP, which is their own alternative when it comes time to make RRSP contributions, and yet they also, through their taxes, are contributing to the government and the teachers' pension plan. So as far as the governance committee is concerned, it's a step forward from what we have now, but more work needs to be done to make sure there are some independent representatives on that pension plan, because ultimately it is that group, employers, employees, and retirees, who will be making decisions about how to manage pension deficits in the future. I say it's an improvement, Madam Speaker, because we know that the record of the Minister of Finance in this government, when they faced a deficit in the public sector superannuation plan, the government workers' pension plan, made a deal with their union, with the government union, that left retirees out in the cold. Current retirees had their benefits retroactively ratcheted back, de-indexed. They weren't even in the room when that deal got made. That is a flaw in the process. It was a great injustice to the thousands of retired members of the government employees plan who, through no fault of their own, had their benefits ratcheted back by a backroom deal by the Minister of Finance and the Nova Scotia Government Employees Union, and they weren't even represented. And that, Madam Chair, is a process that should never be repeated again. It is a process that needs fixing, and so at least now they'll have one voice among 12 in the governance of the new pension agency. With regard to the teachers' plan, Madam Speaker, which is also covered by this Act, Nova Scotians learned a few weeks ago during the session of this House that it faces a $1.5 billion pension deficit, a deficit that, left unattended, is a debt of the entire province of Nova Scotia. Unfortunately, when asked about that deficit, the Premier of Nova Scotia said, well, we're not going to deal with that this year. We'll deal with that in a future year because, after all, markets are volatile right now, and that deficit can go up and down in volatile markets. The problem with that approach, Madam Speaker, is that Nova Scotians see right through it. They know that what the Premier really means is that it's a giant problem that he does not want to address until after the next election. Because after all, by the time they get around to it in the next year or two, there will be an election, and everybody knows it. And so to defer a $1.5 billion problem from now till after the next election does a great injustice to all of the people of Nova Scotia who deserve to know what the government's plan is to deal with that much debt. But they won't know because they're putting it off. And Madam Chair, given the history of this government saying one thing before an election and doing the opposite after the election, both taxpayers and teachers themselves should be very concerned that the government won't tell them what their plan is until after the election has been completed. Madam Chair, that is not fair to them. It's not fair to the teachers that are members of that plan, and it's not fair to the taxpayers. Both of them should be very afraid of what the government might have in mind when the election is over. After all, when they dealt with the deficit in the government workers' plan, they did it by way of a backroom deal. Now we won't know until after the next election. And by the way, to say that the reason is because markets are volatile is such a silly reason. It is insulting to the people of Nova Scotia who know full well markets are always volatile. Markets always go up and down. There is nothing new in that, and it's not going to change. So we'll be watching very carefully, Madam Speaker, as the government avoids dealing with this problem. We'll be watching very carefully any scheming that goes on around the teachers' pension plan, because teachers deserve a fair pension, retired teachers deserve the benefits that they've accrued during their working lives, and they deserve to be at the table with a government that is going to deal with their pension in an open and transparent and fair way, and not slough it off till after the election when who knows what might happen when they're safely re-elected, if that were to ever happen. Madam Chair, moving on to some of the more troubling parts of the Financial Measures Act, I do want to point out that since this is the bill that enacts the tax provisions and other provisions of the budget, that we are now into the fourth budget of the NDP. It contains yet another deficit, over $200 million this year alone, and will add $430.7 billion to the total debt of the province in this 1 year, bringing the growth in our provincial debt under the NDP to $1 billion. Now, Madam Chair, that is a great hardship on the people of the province. We're already one of the most indebted provinces in all of Canada. Everybody knows that. And although they promised to be financially responsible before the last election, and in fact they promised to run balanced budgets from day one, we know that as soon as they got in, not only did they come into this House and repeal the balanced budget law that a previous government had put in to protect taxpayers from these kinds of deficits, they repealed it and instantly started running deficits of their own. And now each and every Nova Scotian shares in an extra $1 billion of debt because of the financial decisions of the NDP since they came in. And do you know what the NDP actually has to say about that, Madam Chair? Do you know what the NDP have to say about that? After inheriting a string of eight consecutive audited balanced budgets, and the single largest payment against our debt under Premier Ham, when they came in and repealed that law and added to our debt, do you know what they have to say about it? The Auditor General of Nova Scotia came to this House and spoke at the Public Accounts Committee, and he said this kind of debt accumulation raises moral concerns about the unfairness of adding that kind of burden onto the backs of future generations of Nova Scotians, on the backs of our children and beyond. And you know what the NDP said to him? Who asked you? That is what the NDP said to the Auditor General of Nova Scotia. Who asked you? Is their attitude about adding $1 billion of new debt on the backs of our children. It's a disgraceful thing to say to the Auditor General of Nova Scotia, but it's even worse to say that to the people of Nova Scotia whose debt they're adding to every step of the way. But you know, Madam Speaker, $1 billion is an interesting number when it comes to promises made and promises broken, because at the end of this year, covered by this Financial Measures Act, that happens to be the same amount, $1 billion, that each and every Nova Scotian will have paid in extra HST since they came into office, having promised not to raise taxes, then raising the HST. Will have $1 billion more in HST revenue because of that one change. And the fact of the matter is, $1 billion, Madam Speaker, $1 billion is more than $1,000 for each and every living, breathing Nova Scotian man, woman, or child.
700 FTEs.
A typical family of four will have paid $4,000 in extra HST because of that decision. No wonder, Madam Chair, no wonder that Nova Scotia's economy grew by the paltry amount of 0.3% in the last year. 0.3% for the province as a whole, because we have the highest sales tax in the country. We have the highest corporate income tax rate at 16% in the country. We have the highest marginal income tax rates for anyone that makes more than $50,000 a year in the country, and in some of our municipalities we have the highest property tax rates in the country. And as we all know all too well this week, we have skyrocketing power bills. On top of all of that adds up to an economy that is losing jobs outside Halifax, that is flatlined, that is going nowhere. And if you assume there is some growth in Halifax and we're only growing at 0.3% overall, you know there's a real recession going on in rural Nova Scotia, where real jobs are being lost, where real families are facing hardship because they broke their promise and took $1 billion extra out of their pockets in HST alone, added $1 billion to their debt. Stand by and watch their power bills go up and their disposable income goes down. It doesn't take a rocket scientist economist to know that that will scuttle the economy and cost real jobs. That is the record of the NDP, which is perpetuated in this Financial Measures Act, Madam Speaker. And how ironic that our power bills have to go up because there is a shrinking base of industrial payers into the power system. The two obvious ones are NewPage and Bowater, each of which were very large customers of Nova Scotia Power. NewPage alone representing almost 13% of power consumption in our province. Bowater down in Liverpool representing about half of that. They're off the grid. They're shut down. They cited power rates as one of the reasons, among others, that they are out of business. And the answer of the power company to that is to raise our power rates even higher because they're no longer on the grid to make a contribution to the cost of distributing power. But, Madam Speaker, if you dig deeper into Nova Scotia Power's reasoning, you'll find out they're not the only ones that are shrinking. They're not the only ones that are shut down. The fact is that in the industrial class of users of power, which includes all of the manufacturers and businesses of the province, are also shrinking. Not because they've become great conservers of power, but because they're cutting back on production. They're cutting back on jobs. They're losing sales because their costs have gone up, their taxes have gone up, regulations have gone up, and now their power bills are going up. Under the NDP, we have entered this vicious circle of a shrinking number of manufacturers to pay for the power system, of a shrinking number of private employers, particularly outside Halifax, to provide real, meaningful, sustainable jobs. We've lost jobs by the thousands on the North Shore, on the South Shore, in Pictou County, because of this vicious circle of a shrinking economy, of losing jobs, of higher costs. That is the record of the NDP. None of that was talked about in their pre-election brochures and pamphlets and advertising. All of that has come to pass in the last 3 years, and this Financial Measures Act perpetuates it. And that is a crying shame, Madam Chair, because we do have one opportunity before us, which is the Irving Shipyard contract, that federal contract that was awarded to Irving on the basis of merit, that all Nova Scotians take pride in the fact that Irving won that work and the workers of Irving won that work on the basis of merit, on the fact that they're the best ship producers in all of Canada. And it is a $25 billion contract that is a great opportunity to kickstart our economy. But, Madam Speaker, as Mr. Jim Irving has told all Nova Scotians, they can't do all the work themselves. They can only do a fraction of the work themselves. They're going to need to subcontract out a lot of that $25 billion of work to other suppliers. And the fact is, those businesses that are going to compete for that subcontracting work do not have to be residents of Nova Scotia. That work can go anywhere in Canada. And it is the job of the government and it's the job of the business community to work together to give our employers the best possible competitive position to win that work, so that the suppliers of the Irving contract aren't in New Brunswick, aren't in Ontario, aren't in BC, but are right here in Nova Scotia, so that all of those jobs and all of that investment can be collected here in our province. But as long as those businesses, those employers, are forced to compete with one hand tied behind their back, we are not in a good position to win that $25 billion worth of work. If they have one hand tied behind their back because they're paying the highest taxes in Canada, if they have one hand tied behind their back because they're paying skyrocketing power bills, if they have one hand tied behind their back because they are facing ever-increasing amounts of paperwork and regulation that keeps them from doing their real job, which is to run an efficient business that can compete with the best in the world, we are not going to win that work. And the record of the NDP in the last 3 years and continuing in this bill is to jack their taxes up, is to let their power rates skyrocket, is to go from a B on regulation to a D on regulation, according to the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. That is the record of this government. And just when business needs to be as competitive as it possibly can, a month after we win the Irving shipyard bid, they bring in first contract arbitration, which again ties a hand behind the back of our employers, particularly the non-unionized ones, who now have a new threat on the horizon. And I will tell you this, Madam Chair, as we talk about all of the other businesses, all of the suppliers to Irving, all the other businesses that want to be the best in the world, you know who's a non-unionized employer who competes for work to bring to Nova Scotia? Michelin. Michelin is exactly the kind of company that we're talking about. Michelin, that has a plant in Bridgewater, where the member for Lunenburg West represents. Michelin, who has a plant in the Valley, where there are several NDP members. Michelin, who has a plant in Pictou County, represented by 3 NDP members. All of those people voted against Michelin. They voted against jobs for their area. They voted for first contract arbitration. They told the people of Nova Scotia it would cost nothing. You know what, Mr. Speaker? In this session, we learned the cost of their votes, because Michelin has 13 plants in North America. Michelin has 30 plants around the world.
Order. I know it's Friday, but please, it's becoming increasingly difficult to hear. I've given you quite a bit of leeway on this one, but the honourable member for the leader for the Progressive Conservative Party has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate your intervention on that. I know that what I'm saying is upsetting to some of the members, particularly the ones that actually represent areas where Michelin employs their constituents, but they should be upset because they had a chance to do the right thing and protect those jobs, and now we know the cost. Because just this month, Michelin announced that they are investing $750 million in one of their plants and creating 500 high-paying, sustainable jobs. And you know where it's going? It's not going to Bridgewater. It's not going to the Valley. They're not going to Pictou County. They are going to South Carolina, and the reason they gave is because the business climate is better there. So the biggest beneficiary of that member's vote from Lunenburg West and his colleagues in the Valley and Pictou County are not his own constituents, but the people of South Carolina. They are the big winners under first contract arbitration. And the shame of it all is that it would have cost nothing. It would have cost nothing. We didn't need a bailout to have those jobs come to Nova Scotia for free. We could have had those jobs by making this place a business-friendly, investment-ready province. And as they insult the people of rural Nova Scotia by moving a handful of jobs outside of Halifax, they should remember that they cost Nova Scotia 500 high-paying rural manufacturing jobs, each and every one of them on their heads, because they did the wrong thing. They voted against jobs in their own ridings, and now they insult the people of rural Nova Scotia with a few crumbs from Halifax. Shame on them, Madam Speaker. Perhaps I'll move on to another contentious part of the bill, Madam Speaker, which is, of course, the infamous Clause 3, the sales tax clause, which makes another pre-election insulting tomfoolery, sham commitment by the NDP to possibly, maybe, hopefully someday, consider lowering the HST after the next election. Here we go again, Madam Speaker. Here we go again. As we go into year 4 of the government's mandate, they make another promise about taxes. Nova Scotians have been down this road before. Nova Scotians have heard this before. Nova Scotians know one thing now that they didn't know last time, and that is the true record of the NDP in government. And that is that they say one thing before the election, they say whatever it takes to get elected, and then afterwards they go back on their word, and in this case, they get back on their word by taking the HST and jacking it up to the highest in Canada. Now, Madam Chair, I think we all know that the reason this Clause 3 is in this bill is because the NDP members themselves also know this to be true. They know that they broke their word. They know that they fooled the people of Nova Scotia once before. They know that if we're going to talk about taxes again in the run to this election, they're going to have to try and find a way to show people that maybe they'll keep their promise this time. And as a result, they planted this goofy, silly, sham clause, Clause 3, in this year's Financial Measures Act. Everyone in this House who makes laws for a living knows that the Financial Measures Act is the bill that implements the budget measures, the tax measures of the budget for the current year. Everybody who has followed our great traditions about budget making under our system of government knows that to be true for this legislature and for all legislatures. For Ottawa, for London, England, for all the parliaments of the world, you have a Financial Measures Act to implement the budget measures of this year. And for very good reason, because when governments propose to change things like tax rates and make other tax changes, they don't telegraph them in advance so that they don't cause consumers and others that are going to be affected to take actions that they wouldn't otherwise take, to gain a benefit that they wouldn't otherwise gain, to confer an advantage over one person over another. That's why we have lockups. That's why we have budget secrecy, so that everybody knows at the same time when a tax is changing, and they know in the year that it's going to change. But now, for this one time, this government has decided that they want to make a promise about a tax change that may possibly could have happened 2 years and 3 years from now. And the obvious question is why, and the obvious answer is because they did this before and they didn't keep their word, and now they want to find a way to show people that they mean it. But we also know that it's just a clause in a bill that will become law, like other clauses in previous bills that were made law by previous governments, like the balanced budget law that says the government can't run a deficit. It was a clause in a bill that became law. But when you elect a government and they get into office, everyone knows they can simply retract that law, as the NDP did in the case of the balanced budget law, so they could then run deficits. So this clause has no more value under this NDP government than that one did. That a majority vote, if they're ever re-elected and given a chance to fool us again, will result in the same outcome. But I'll get into that in more detail in just a moment, because I do want to spend a moment or two on the Liberal Party amendment that they tried to make to Clause 3 yesterday. We supported the amendment for the very obvious reason that Nova Scotians deserve as much protection as they can possibly get from another broken NDP promise. It was presented as an insurance policy against more NDP broken promises. I will point out that, like all insurance policies, it comes with a pretty heavy premium, because the premium in this case is the re-election of an NDP government, a premium that is too expensive for Nova Scotians to pay to have this kind of insurance in place. But at least the amendment was put to this House as an attempt to try and hold the NDP's feet to the fire if they were ever to try and break their promise again. The problem with the amendment, of course, Madam Speaker, is that, like any other clause in any other bill, it can be repealed by a majority vote of a re-elected government. And so, although Nova Scotians would pay the premium to have this insurance, they would have that insurance yanked away from them, like they did before with the balanced budget law,